So welcome. Welcome to the ISCET meeting for the Australasia region. There's a couple of items to talk through today. So in the last meeting, we had a chat about determining the structure of the standards. So how should they be organised? Should they be organised by eye movement class? Should they be organised by disease? So there were a few kind of suggestions around that. There was a talk of which standard to do first. We've had the suggestion that this should possibly be the nystagmus standard. And so then starting to think through subcommittee recruitment, so initiating that recruitment process for subcommittees responsible for the first standard. So there has been a call that's gone out on the forum for people who are interested, I think, to develop this first nystagmus standard. Were there any comments or any thoughts from anyone in our region around how the standards should be structured? Would love cameras and voices here, team. No thoughts. We're pretty happy with what happened in the previous meeting. I don't know if people have had a chance to review that recording. Hi Mark, how you doing? So I was just saying we're talking through how the ISCET standards should be organised. That's been discussed in the last couple of meetings for both the Africa and the Americas regions. So I think the conversation on that, it hasn't really come to a strong conclusion around whether that should be individual eye movement groups such as saccades, or whether that should be focusing and thinking about diseases. And there's kind of a bit of a thought that maybe there's both in terms of the structure. There was an interesting discussion from a manufacturer's perspective on what should that algorithm look like when we're planning to put specific eye movement patterns into clinical equipment. So really making sure that works. This meeting really is a continuation of that to kind of see if there's any interest in or thoughts in terms of how things should be structured that are different to what's come up in the last couple of meetings. Just giving our region a bit of a chance to think about that. No thoughts from the group? No? Okay. Are we all happy with the nystagmus being the first standard that's developed, I guess, is the question that I wanted to kind of ask the group. Yep, thumbs up from Deborah. I'm happy with emojis. Yep, great. So yeah, there is an open subcommittee recruitment for the first standard. We have had a response from ISEV actually, so I'll just talk that through and see if people had any thoughts. So Ruth from ISEV has proposed a joint collaboration between the ISET members who volunteer for the nystagmus standard guideline and ISEV members with an interest in clinical eye tracking. Some of whom may or may not already be ISET members and who also volunteer for the nystagmus standard / guideline. She's put forward the point that with an ISET / ISEV badge, the standard or guideline development could then follow ISEV's usual pathway, with peer review provided by scrutiny and feedback from membership of both societies and submission for publication dependent on favourable votes from both societies' membership. The advantage, I think, to this proposal is that it would provide a home and an update process for the publication of the standard guideline in Documenta Ophthalmologica. There's no permanence to this arrangement. It only needs to be like that as long as it kind of works and both groups are happy with that. And ISEV is broadening its scope anyway at the moment. So whether or not that would fit nicely in a broad scope is that ISCET would be collaborating with a society that's not just electrophysiology. So does anybody have any thoughts? Are we happy with this as a path to move forward? Any comments around that?
So may I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'm not understand well the previous meetings. So but to tell the truth, I don't have any clinical cases. So do you have someone have a clinical data set of eye tracking?
Do you mean as a sort of a standard clinical data set
Yeah.
provided to?
Mm,
There's been comments about doing the norms
mm,
for these particular data sets once they're there. I don't think any one lab has the data set as such because I think a lot of
mm,
these are around how would we design the ideal protocol. And there is a big push to make
mm,
sure
mm,
that in whoever signs up for the committee and how that works, that it's not
mm,
one lab or one region specific,
mm,
to try and pull some of the biases out. But yes, I think it would be great to have this is
mm,
what's normal and that's kind of a cutoff. But I think that might be a secondary piece after establishing what the protocol itself should be for each of the
mm,
eye movements, if that makes sense.
mm, mm,
That might be saccades need to have 50 or 60 trials, whatever it ends up being. And
mm,
then looking at these are the normal latencies that we get with that, and the normal kind of gains and stuff like that. There is a call from the manufacturing side to kind of also then specify minimum requirements to run those protocols.
yeah. Mm,
Not necessarily making them any particular piece of equipment specific, but just saying these
mm,
are the general principles that would need
mm,
to be around that.
mm, mm.
Does that make sense? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I understand. But these work will be based on several type of clinical data of eye tracking.
Yep.
So we can share this type of data. So because we will discuss about standard. So several type of data should be compared.
Yeah, so you're saying
Mm,
the data output needs to be a part of the standard as well.
mm.
Okay, yep, yep.
Yeah,
I
okay.
think
Thank you.
that's an
Thank you.
important point.
And also, in this meeting is also collaborate with the Asian Pacific region
Mm-hmm.
or yeah. So but mm,
So this meeting is purely for the Asia Pacific region, recognizing that a lot of the meetings happen at, midnight,
mm-hmm,
2
mm-hmm.
a.m.,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah,
us.
yeah.
So that's why we've got the three different regions to kind of make sure that everyone has a say or has their opportunity to have an input into some of the things that are developing. So things that get
Mm-hmm,
talked about at one meeting are kind of brought through in terms of the themes to have consistency across the meetings. Matt, I think, has been at all of them except this one. He emailed saying it's
mm-hmm.
3 a.m. for me. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hopefully that kind of makes sense. Did you have any thoughts around the development of these and how you think they should be structured?
Yeah, I am also how to say it's a kind of engineering part. So then I usually analyze eye tracking data.
Mhm.
However, I don't have any clinical field. So then how to say a few data set share with collaborators. So then I cannot propose good how to say standard criteria. So then I'm a little bit worried about my contribution. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. That so the standard is not saying, hey, it has to be people from Asia Pacific. Anyone is welcome
Mm,
to join the subcommittee from any of the
mm-hmm,
regions.
mm-hmm,
We're talking through the fact that we think each of the subcommittees probably does need a clinical lead.
mm-hmm,
For someone who's regularly in that space, and understanding that group. The reason that the group is picked in nystagmus is that there's a
mm-hmm.
lot of interest and some quite strong researchers in that space who are
Yeah,
happy
yeah.
to kind of work on that as the first pass.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all
Mhm.
right.
Thank you.
That's just following on. Did anyone have any other questions or thoughts? Mark, Deborah, and hello to the new person. I do very much struggle with not having cameras. Um, Yeah, so I guess the question is, do we think that that would fit well as a collaboration with ISEV? Um, yep. Can I have a thumbs up from people or a... Yep, great. Mark, thoughts? I think he's disappeared. Okay, so I will send that back to the wider group and say, yep, we think, working with ISEV kind of makes sense and putting it in Documenta Ophthalmologica makes sense. Everyone's happy with nystagmus being the first standard. So if you do want to be on that subcommittee or you think, there are points that you'd like to make sure that come across, you can put up your interest on the forum to say, yes, I'm interested in being involved in that subcommittee. I think it's important that we have representation, not just from clinicians though, but actually from people like yourself that are going to be looking at the data, that are thinking about it from different perspectives. So thinking about it from the manufacturing side, thinking about it from the analysis side to make sure that that's got all of those stakeholders and viewpoints. So that's the main one. The other one that they wanted to bring up was the integration of eye tracking into routine clinical practice. There are some practicalities that are likely to come up for wider adoption. Did anyone have any thoughts around that? So I think that thing that you brought up in terms of how they get analysed and having a normative database is very important. I think there's also some elements of what does someone who's new to this field need to be able to run these, and making sure that if you get results in one clinic, they can be compared to another clinic. So I think there's some practicalities around some of that as well. I do think there will also probably need to be a piece once these are run. So when we're thinking about that normative database of test retest and test retest in different labs as well. Or different clinical centres, as the case may be. I realise I keep saying labs, but it probably needs to be clinical centres rather than that research sphere that I think has driven a lot of this. Um, in terms of thinking about prioritisation of standards, did anyone have any thoughts of what we might look at after nystagmus? Yes, no thoughts?
So may I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So in this occasion, I have a question. So because I mentioned that so I'm not a medical sector. So so in a hospital, yeah. So in a purpose to establish a standard eye tracking survey in a hospital or a clinic. So then how to say? I'm living in Japan currently. So how to say? In a hospital, we usually measure the eye tracking. So maybe how to say hospital service is based on a national health service.
Mhm.
So then if every country covers how to say clinical surveillance or clinical diagnosis using eye tracking.
I think that's where we would like to go. I'm not sure
Mm,
how much clinical eye tracking gets used or not used and how that differs from country
mm,
to country. Um,
mm, mm,
yeah, there's definitely a need for the standard. So the survey that went out sort of said, yes, it is being
mm,
eye tracking is being used for some of
mm,
those aspects in terms of thinking about diagnosis as well.
mm,
An example is Niemann-Pick type C and
mm,
dementia groups. But it's being done at the moment differently by every service. I think that's part of the problem. So that's where we sort of said I think nystagmus is one that should happen first because there is a lot of labs who are doing nystagmus clinically on a regular basis. But yeah, it's then thinking about, well, when we organize and structure these standards, should they be the individual eye movement levels themselves? Should they be disease specific or should there be both, where there's disease protocol and saying these eye movements are what comes into this, and then this is the normal or not normal standard for each of these. I don't think we've really settled on a structure. I think that's part of why ISCET is kind of looking at it and going, okay, this might be a good partnership because we've got a kind of a structure for how we put these together from electrophysiology tests. So thinking about how we run electrophysiology and then where that fits into different conditions.
Yeah. So therefore, so personally, if some countries, employers, eye tracking, diagnosis as a clinical service, I want to learn which type of surveillance, medical surveillance was conducted using eye tracking. Yeah, it may be a side story. So because how to say, eye tracking clinical surveillance is depend on every country's each country's health system, healthcare, national health service, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, so it should be also considered for the standard
So
meeting.
each country's health needs to consider the standard, or you think they need to input? I'm confused there.
Yeah, so some countries have already introduced eye tracking for the medical surveillance. Yeah, we should learn the how to say current standard over
Yeah, I think they all run on different protocols though, and so that's what the group is sort of saying is we want to have representatives from as many different regions as we can across different stakeholder viewpoints, across, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's the clinical perspective, whether that's a researcher perspective, because it is that thing of if I had my eyes tracked in Japan, they might be different to what's tracked in Melbourne to what's tracked in Leicester at the moment, and that's problematic because we'd like a patient to be able to move, for example, and not have to come back to the same lab to be monitored. Particularly if they're doing before and after surgery type stuff, and the nystagmus I think is where this gone.
So another topic is how to say adult and children and babies layer. So in some clinics measure the eye movement of babies to it's a kind of screening. So it's not a popular in the worldwide. So in a adult and baby and children is some layers in a different application maybe exist. I also learned which type of eye movement assessment was conducted for up to the age or development of human.
I think there would need to be age normals done. So when doing that from the protocol, but there may be adjustments within protocols that need to be done. So if the protocol was particularly long, for example, I don't think my 2-year-old would sit through that. Yeah, I think that's a good viewpoint is making sure that it is across would regularly be encountered for that age group. Do you think that would be picked up by the disease specific organisation of the structures, or do you think there needs to be that the age groups need to be banded, for example?
Yeah, so sorry, I don't know the details, but I sometimes read a paper in some countries. Eye tracking introduced to babies. I observe clinical studies in US and Italy. And so I would like learn so details in every system in every country.
Mm. Yeah, at the moment they're all different, and that's I think where we're
Mm,
looking to put that standard protocol in place.
mm,
It's working out what that looks like. So it's going, should that be for a particular disease, and then we say you run these tests, or should it be at an individual test level, a normative database for it? There may be asterisks of this is how this gets amended in this particular age group. So for babies, for example, it might be this is, these are the things that have to be amended to get this, and these are the normative databases in that kind of group. I think that's an interesting kind of perspective to go, but then you've also got the question of what's the minimum hardware standard is as well, I guess, in terms of running this and thinking about, the frame rates and the other aspects to what needs to be in that particular piece. Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. And that's part of why we need to have these conversations in all the different time zones.
Okay, so thank you very much.
That's all right. No worries. Yeah, I think that also comes into that integration of eye tracking into routine clinical practice. So where we think things should become part of the norm. I think that will depend a little bit on the clinicians in the different countries as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we'll be able to do country by country. I think it will be the 3 regions that have been set up. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all right. Did anyone have any other thoughts around how the standards should be structured?
Hi, I'm Amanda. Hi, everyone. I just have quite a few questions about it. Yeah, as Nakayama said, yes, I totally agree that because currently in research, these parameters we wanted to determine or decide is purely based on data. So if the data from Asian, the participants are Asian, participants are from Western, the eye shape is really different. So the parameter is going to different too. So in order to get some outcome from the data. So what I'm trying to think about is that whether these protocol or standard, they are based on data or based on what you said is the minimum requirement or standards, what based on data. It's a little bit, yeah, I mean that lot to decision like we needed to think about that. See, yeah, as you also mentioned, we have to justify that. How do we justify that? Yes, how do we see that this standard is helpful or yes, that's useful to these clinicians. I also have a question about this because I'm not clinicians. So I'm doing the research. Like in research, we have to validate our results, hypotheses. But in clinical settings, you don't need to do that, right? You just use eye tracker to diagnose some disease. Is my understanding correctly? So you just directly use that. Whether this diagnosis you're using eye tracker is right or wrong, actually, as clinicians, you don't know, right? So if we just see the difference between the settings using eye tracker in the setting of clinician, clinical settings or different to research, we need to understand how do we use that, the difference when we're using these eye trackers. Yeah, as a clinician, probably can you please like explain to us, like let us know, then maybe we know how do we move forward, like we can make contributions or yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea is to have, in the same way that you kind of have standard protocols in research, the idea is to have a minimum standard protocol, and it might be, you need to run this number of trials doing this particular task. and these different tasks all fit into providing a diagnosis for eye tracking. The problem at the moment is that there's a range of protocols and none of them are standardized between the different labs. And I think this comes back to your point around the different countries. They're all doing something a little bit different, and even within countries, they're all doing something a little bit different at the moment. I think what ISCET is trying to get at is to provide a minimum benchmark so that a patient could go from one clinic in one country to another clinic in another country and have comparable results. That I think is kind of the end goal around some of those pieces, because there's going to be different hardware that's there, and we want to kind of make a minimum standard, not to say that others couldn't do something different or beyond that, but having that kind of minimum, this is what we've run, so therefore those results can be compared and contrasted. I do definitely think there needs to be normative databases around what's then the norms. There has been discussion around, could we have standard analysis programs, for example? Again, though, there's a really big push to not make it one company or one tracker or one particular analysis program specific, but having these are the parameters that you analyze, or this is how you pick some of these up, the sort of generic principles around that protocol type stuff, that I think is what they're trying to aim to do with these standards, but being very generic or about how they're done, so that there's not that bias of, I prefer this particular kind of eye tracker, so we'll only support this, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think as a researcher, like we might explore different methods, like using the eye tracker. Yes, I guess as clinician, I don't know what they do like this. So are you a clinician?
Yeah, I'm an optometrist.
Yeah.
So
okay. But you are a researcher too.
I am, yes.
So
I understand what you're saying. Like, we might look at different targets, for example, and different ways to run a protocol. And I think that's where the question also comes into how often do we need to update the standards, for example, or to review the standards and go, what is the new evidence telling us from researchers in terms of how this should be done and updated? We're hoping that, at least for some of those initial standards, they will be fairly well set. There's a couple of very big nystagmus labs around that see a lot of patients, that we're kind of hoping that will be helpful for, hey, these are the things that you should run. That's not to say you can't run additional things, but to have kind of that standardized protocol to run in the same way that you might look at it and go, okay, this is my method section in a research paper, and this is what I've done, and I've used this one because that's standardized and I'll reference this thing. It would become a sort of an ISCET standard protocol, and I can reference the ISCET standard, for example.
Yes, but I'll just see you mentioned that's based on the evidence. Like, as a researcher, we see that there's evidence, then we just drive us to do that. So, as same for the standard, should we collect the evidence from the literature, then comes to the conclusion that yes, we need to do this? And also maybe come from the manufacturer based on their experiments, experience, or their something. Just say based on what? Based on data, based on evidence from this literature, or based on this experiment experience from these manufacturers, or see. Then we know what to do. Like, if we need the evidence, we just collect evidence from the literature. So that's just see. What guide us to do the next?
I think that's the point of the subcommittee, and why we want a diverse subcommittee to have all of those different perspectives. So thinking about the things that are important to all of the different stakeholders when measuring eye movements clinically. So there will be some that will come from the research evidence. There is definitely still research gaps for a lot of these. So it might come down to clinical expertise and what people have been doing in that space, and having that discussion broadly and kind of poking at it. And I think it will also lead to more research questions in terms of, hey, we need some evidence in this space. So I think that's also where the standards should be reviewed on that kind of a regular basis. to go, okay, is there new evidence here that means we should be altering what we're doing? With the thought, though, that we want to try and keep standards comparable. So we don't want to be making major changes to a standard unless there's a very good reason to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark, did you have a question or a comment before?
Yes. Hi, Amanda. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Hi, how you doing?
Hello. All right. So I represent a manufacturer of equipment,
Okay.
and I joined the last meeting, and I wonder if I misunderstood something. Eye tracking for me is also about when we're making measurements on the retina, or putting a stimulus on the retina, whether it's microperimetry or multifocal ERG. There's this idea that a subject must be able to focus and, on a target, must be able to fixate. And if they're not able to fixate, then the data is not going to be very good. And of course, we'd like to also do testing on people who can't fixate as well, which means then that we have to track the gaze or track the retina and adapt the stimulus, move the stimulus around so that it's tracking, or decide that if the eye movement is too sudden for tracking, then we have to eliminate the data. We have to have some thresholds to eliminate the data. And I wonder if what we're talking about here in terms of tracking, could it eventually lead to something, to a standard about eye tracking for the purpose of making other measurements other than tracking, if you understand what I mean. So for example, from my standpoint, the reason I kind of latched on to this was because I've been thinking about, from an equipment standpoint, about a multifocal ERG that would include eye tracking. And when you have to think about that, then you have to start thinking about the eye movement, and you start wondering about, well, what are all the possible scenarios that I need to think about? Wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of a standard or something I could follow, so that it would be seen as a standard, and so then other manufacturers could do the same, and then we would have basically a similar way of tracking the eye. And an example of this is not quite an example, but there is an analogy in microperimetry, where there is an eye tracking algorithm in those systems, but they're proprietary. We don't quite know for sure exactly what it's doing. And so two different equipment vendors might be implementing this a little bit differently. And so that's what I'm thinking about, but I'm not sure that this is what we're talking about in this meeting, or maybe you can comment on that, Amanda.
I think it's a different category of eye movements. I think it would fit very nicely with the overlap with ISCET. I think it's really thinking about a different type of eye tracking to what we often think about when we think video-based eye trackers, with the your corneal reflexes, as opposed to tracking the retina. I do think that tracking the retina is becoming far more common in that clinical space when you're thinking about different ways to present and that fine level of presentation. I think that's probably one of the other standards that would need to be developed at some point, would be standards around retinal-based tracking. So thinking about how quick they need to be, what needs to happen there. to be able to join with some of these things, as you sort of said, multifocal ERG, but equally to then be able to present, we're seeing presentations to single cones, we're seeing eye tracking for OCTs, for example, and so I think it is just I think it's often thought of differently, because I think a lot of us who've come through eye tracking have come through thinking about video-based trackers, but I think it's a different category of tracking that definitely has a clinical place. So different hats on there when thinking about those, but I think it would just fall into a different group of eye tracking. Mark, does that answer your question and kind of make sense?
Yes, it does. So it's, if I understood correctly, you're saying it's really out of scope. What I'm thinking about is out of the scope of what we're talking about here.
It's in a, I don't think it's out of scope. I think it's in scope, but I think it's in scope in a slightly different category, if that makes sense.
Okay, so maybe in the future, after
yeah. I think it's a standard that we should eventually do. I don't think it's what people initially think when they think of tracking nystagmus, for example, as the first piece. I think when they're thinking that, we are thinking video-based eye trackers, but I do think that as the technology develops, that retinal-based tracking will need to have a standard. And so it's thinking about, well, what are the minimum requirements for retinal-based tracking to be accurate? And where does that get applied? So that's where that structure of standards becomes important, because there'll be a range of clinical conditions that will need retinal-based tracking, where tracking at the front of the eye with video-based stuff will not be appropriate. So yes,
thank you.
in scope, but I don't think it's in scope for nystagmus at the moment, is what I'm saying.
Yes, understood. Thanks.
Yeah, I just think like it's about the how to use the eye tracker, right? Because if you use a eye tracker properly, you can get a good result data. If you don't use correctly, the data doesn't make any sense. So last time, I think they have the discussion whether we just have a common standard first, like everyone can use that regardless of the different fields, or we just start the standard of a specific field. But I think that how to use eye tracker is a common, it's not related to any disease, but it's a common minimum standard, like how to get the reliable data.
Yeah, I think that comes into Matt's question of how do you integrate eye tracking into routine clinical practice? So what do is it thinking about how you get a good reflection, the different eye shapes that are there, making, how do you track through glasses? What are the issues that come up, whether you've got people wearing heavy mascara, for example? So I think there are pieces there, and I don't know, a lot of us have learned this through research or through other bits and pieces in terms of how to run an eye tracker, but equally thinking that they are going to be different, and they're going to be different requirements for different eye tracking technologies. So as Mark's pointed out, there are now eye trackers for retinal-based tracking to have that high speed, fine precision to be able to present things. I think that will also be equally relevant when we're thinking about specific conditions, but the requirements to undertake that sort of tracking with good data are going to be different. So I think the standards, when we're looking at them, as you said, it probably need to have a minimum, this is your minimum data quality to get something decent out of these. And yeah, it is that question of how do we help people into clinical eye tracking? How do we help introduce people to this as a process who don't necessarily want to be researchers? And that's a weird one with two hats on, kind of going. Yeah. Does anyone have any sort of comments around? Yeah, go.
Yeah, so may I ask you a similar question? So I'm not sure that ISCET member from a clinical region know well a variety of eye tracking procedure. So then the standardization is required. it's so in my major interest in the pupil reaction.
Yep.
So some research papers, review papers summarize how to say measuring procedures and in response to the detecting disease. And also even the eye tracking issues. Mental effort, mental workload measurement review papers summarize some cases and classified to the measuring protocols and detecting features of eye movement and also contributions. So yeah, so in this discussion is for the clinical survey. So then some papers, some review papers summarize procedures in clinical measurement or diagnosis. So if possible, please share these type of papers for members, because I mentioned earlier, I'm a technological region. So then I know that measuring techniques, but which type of procedures should be standardized? So it may be clearer for me to the purpose of this project. You understand?
Yeah, it's thinking about which standard. So what do we use clinically, and of those, so nystagmus is come up because it's done in different labs and it's done slightly differently in those labs. And it would be great to have them kind of have that standardization. I think there is that thought process, though, that there's a bunch of protocols that can be used for multiple things. And so that's where there is this thought process of different hierarchies of this is sort of the protocol that you need to run, but this is perhaps the data quality level that you need to have it at to be looking at saccades or be looking at smooth pursuit. And then thinking about what are the changes in the different diseases in those particular protocols, because at the moment they're all done differently. Saccades are done with different numbers of trials at different distances in different sort of random orders with what size stimulus, for example. And so there isn't the capacity to compare those across labs. And that I think in the same way that you have research protocols that get used and get repeated, that's where I think we're looking for a clinical protocol that someone who's research can implement. But equally then thinking about how that drives the manufacturing side of things to be able to go, okay, for a clinician, I've implemented these ISCET specific protocols, so you can just click the button and run these without having to understand all of the background algorithmic stuff that goes on to present those and then to perhaps analyze those. So that's kind of where people are looking for that element of it, because as researchers, I want to have access to all of the raw data and all of the pieces underneath that are underlying that. Whereas with my clinical hat on, I want to run the test and give the output of the test. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and also, I want to know the target of which type of disease using eye tracking. So I mentioned that. So I focus on the pupil response. Is also sometimes focus on dementia. Sometimes how to say mental workload, and even the eye tracking. So how to say sometimes measuring emotional state and mental workload. So maybe measuring purpose is make specific procedures. So if clinical survey, maybe procedures depend on the target disease, I think.
Yeah, I think that's where people were sort of thinking about the structure of the standards. So should we have, particular diseases where we say, hey, these are the eye movements that you should be running, and then these are the protocols attached to it that you should be running for those groups, as you said, dementia, thinking about some of the neurocognitive conditions that are attached to some of those. I definitely think there's room and there's scope for that, and that's probably
Mm.
things are likely to go next. But I don't speak for the whole group in that. But that's kind of been the process. I think with Picton and Nystagmus, unless people have very strong opinions otherwise, because there is that large group of people that are part of ISCET who are happy to contribute and do that. I do think there will be new groups that will come up when we start doing some of the other standards, and I don't know whether or not there'll be individual eye movement groups or whether they'll be disease specific. But I think that's where we need to think about that subcommittee up in terms of who's on those committees.
Yeah, so it is maybe complicated. So then let focus on one or two disease. It's a first case, the major case. Yeah, so how to measure the eye movement? Yeah, maybe it's better. It may be so simpler. So this task, I think, specific disease we focus on, and which type of eye movement, future of eye movement is required to the diagnosis or surveillance.
Yeah, but I think the question is coming though from well, there might be horizontal saccades that are relevant one disease and to another disease and another one. Can we have a standard protocol for, say, horizontal saccades?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where that question of the different structures and the layers have gone to. I did like your point though of share the papers to the group. One of the questions that I have is where some of those papers should be held. So if they are published in Documenta Ophthalmologica, do we need to be looking to host them, say, on the ISCET website so that if you're a member, you can come and access them, or looking at access options for some of that?
Okay.
Yeah. Would that be helpful? Are people able to just access the different journals as they are at the moment, or would we be looking for access to ISCET standards sort of post somewhere on the site?
Okay. Yeah, so maybe these procedures should be discussed later. Yeah, how to share the information.
Yeah, I think the different procedures and the different diseases will be discussed by the different subgroups. I don't know which one will be done in which order and which. I think we're doing the nystagmus first, but beyond that, I don't know. But yeah, I'm wondering if people have any strong feelings about where these protocols should be stored, and if we're members of ISCET, does that mean should we have an access option to them outside of just standard academic access to journals?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
maybe helpful to the members, I think.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they should have some members portal type thing, and we have them collated so that you can easily see them in their hierarchy.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all right, no worries.
Yeah, can we ask the subcommittee, like just to have some key members there, then they make a plan like how they are going to do that, then we know whether we in or out, like whether we can do some contributions. Yeah. Is that possible to ask them to do that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think at the moment it's just everyone who's interested sort of see and make the subcommittee of people that are really interested in developing that aspect. I don't think we've sort of had an in or out type approach at the moment. It's been fairly.
Oh, I mean, yeah, if they have found some key members for the subcommittee, then they make a plan, then let us know, then we see, okay, I can contribute to this task, like then I just I would love to do that, but at the moment I don't know what's the plan, like what I can contribute to. It's hard to know at this stage.
Yeah. I think there's been sort of conversation around having key stakeholder groups represented in that subcommittee that might not necessarily be. So we've said we definitely need at least one sort of clinical lead for each of those, for example. But I also think, do we need a manufacturing person that's bringing that input and that thought around, how do the algorithms work? What does this mean? Is this feasible kind of questions? I don't know whether or not we're going to have a research spot in some of those subcommittees to kind of go, what is the current evidence group for that? I'm not quite sure how that will fit, but I think there probably needs to be a bit of discussion around what are the key roles that we have to fit for a subcommittee.
Yeah, I just think what is the key tasks? If we know the key tasks, then we just can do it or not. We wanted to join it or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you thinking that the key tasks can go out to the broader group, or you want to, a general call for, hey, can we have people who would contribute this way to the subcommittee?
Yeah, I think that we can make the call. I think the call has made out. There are some people showed interest. If they can just have a discussion to see what is the task they are planning to do, maybe we can see I can do this, then I join the subcommittee.
Yep.
Yes, see. But I mean, the plan can be revised later, like with more people joining, interested in that, we can revise the plan. Yes, it's just I have first got the tasks passed out, so we know.
Yep. No, I think that's a good point. We can feed that back into the broader group. And just sort of say, when we develop these, can you work out what expertise is needed, or what's missing, and make a call?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Does anyone have any other business just before? We've got about 7 minutes left. No, everyone's happy. Great. Well, thank you guys for coming along. And the recording of this will get posted up on the ISCET website, but I'll also put all of the points that we've talked about today up there to be discussed and thrown around in, I think it's Africa after this, as a sub-region. But yes, please keep monitoring the forum, because that's where things will come through. And thank you guys for coming along today. This has been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Amanda.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.